what I'd like to do today, we've got a lot of topics to cover, and what I thought we would do is, I wanted to do two things. One is I wanted to give you an overview of the economy, because that's kind of what I usually do. Because I was President Bush's chief economic advisor, my role when I was in that job was actually, I had a lot of roles, obviously, but one of the things that I had to do was to be the chief forecaster of the United States, a job at which I was terrible, although no worse than my predecessors, nor my successors. But anyway, that was my job, so I thought we'd continue that tradition. Let me just kind of give you an update on where we are, what's going on, and so forth. How many people think that the President Trump has turned things around for the economy? I know you probably don't want to admit this, but if you do, if you think so, raise your hands. How many think so? Okay, so a few of you do think so. So let's look at the numbers and see what the numbers say. Well, here's a picture of growth rates over the past few years. And if you look at 2018, indeed, it is higher, considerably higher than the recovery average. The recovery average was about a little over 2%. Last year was getting up toward the 3% range. And right now, we are at 3.1. We had a kind of a crummy first quarter, but a really good second quarter. Third quarter looks pretty good. Looks like it's going to come in somewhere in the 3% neighborhood. You don't know for sure, but somewhere in there, and it could be as high as 4. So if that were the case, this would be a break with the past. Now, whether the president and his policies are responsible for that or not is a different issue. But it certainly does look like things have moved in the right direction recently. If we compare where the U.S. has been, even during the weak recovery, and it was a weak recovery, that's an objective statement, we still look good relative to other countries. So if you think about how did we do during this weak recovery, there we are in the red bar, and UK is pretty good, Canada's pretty good. But even when you compare us to what most people think of as the juggernaut of Europe, Germany, which is the biggest economy and arguably the richest of the big economies, Germany was only growing at about 1.5%. So we look good by comparison with some of those economies as well. How about China? I'll bet how many people have heard of China, right? A lot of people, right? Everybody's always worried about China. And China is extremely important for a couple of reasons. But one is, first of all, it's the second largest economy in the world now. But beyond that, it's the second largest, and it's growing very rapidly. So despite the fact that growth rates have fallen off, and they have fallen off considerably, this is not the best year for China. Despite that, Chinese growth is still in the 6 to 7% range. So these numbers, by the way, how many people believe those numbers? You look at those numbers. What might give you some skepticism? Anybody see something that jumps out at you? These numbers as compared with the previous charts that I showed you? Here, let me see if I can give you a hint. Look at the US, okay? Look at China. What do you see? Too consistent, right, too consistent. Looks kind of smooth. So you tend not to see that kind of smoothness in any GDP series. So when you see something like that happening, kind of makes you think, maybe it's not quite accurate. Now, China, of course, has a different economy than the kinds of economies that you're seeing in the US and the other G7 countries. So that could explain some of it, but it's probably smoothed. Part of it is smooth in large part because the Chinese don't have really good data on what's going on in their economy. They have to estimate it. So if you're estimating it, if you're just giving essentially a backward-looking projection on what's going on, that's going to tend to be smooth. Point is this. If you look at these numbers, even if they're wrong, they're not that far from right. And I'll tell you that because I was in China. I was one of the first Americans in China. I went there in the early 80s when it had just opened up to Americans. And it was just a completely different place. You know, you'd go in and you would be, how many people have been to China? Raise your hands, been to China. Okay, a lot of you have been to China. So recently, I assume, pretty recently. Well, in those days, if you, I wouldn't say drove down, if you were on one of the streets in Beijing or in Shanghai, you might see a car every 10 minutes or so. I mean, there were basically no cars. There were bicycles only. People were wearing Mao coats. It was just a completely different country. And if you see where they are now, you know, scarcely 30 years later, 3 decades, the world has never seen a transformation like that, ever, literally ever. So in order to get from there to here, you got to have growth rates that are something like this. So even if these numbers are off, they're not that far off, okay? All right. How about the current economy? How many people think that we're at full employment? Well, it says we're not. No, because we have too much job creation. Isn't that weird? Too much job creation. Sounds good to have job creation, doesn't it? All right, well, think about this for a second. Suppose you're in a recovery and you are getting back jobs that you lost during the recession. What's going to happen to job growth? Is it going to be really high or is it going to be really low? Really high, right? Obviously, really high. And what it's going to have to be higher than is population growth. Why? Because you got to make up not only for the new people coming in, you not only have to have jobs for the new people coming in, but you also have to make up for the jobs that you lost. So during a recovery, job growth is fast, faster than population growth. During a recession, it's exactly the opposite. Job growth is slow, slower than population growth, and that's why the unemployment rate is going up. Okay, well, what's happening right now? What's happening right now is job growth is still too fast. Job growth is still about 100,000 a month higher than what it takes to keep up with the population. So not quite twice as high, but like 1.5 times what you'd need to keep up with population growth. That tells you we're not yet at the peak. We're still in recovery mode. That's the easiest way to see it, okay? So that's kind of good. It means that even though the economy is still doing really well, unemployment rates are low, jobs are available, even though all that's happening, we still have some room to grow. I want to do this by way of an analogy. So I'm going to give you an example. So let's say there is a woman and she earns $2,000 a month take-home pay. So her take-home salary is $24,000 a year, which is livable, but obviously not a rich person. She goes out, she takes her salary one month, gets the paycheck, goes down to Best Buy and buys a home entertainment system for the family, okay? Spends the whole paycheck. Now, 2 ways for her to finance that. One is she pays it cash. And so she takes the money that she got from the check, she goes out and she buys the system with the check. An alternative is she runs a deficit. What does running a deficit mean? Running a deficit means that she borrows. She finances it over time. Now, the question is, which is better? Which do you think is better? Is it better to spend it right up front, or is it better to finance it over time? Well, it's not so obvious. Why? Because if she spends the money right up front, she doesn't have anything to pay her rent. She can't buy food. How's she going to pay her bills that month, right? So that's not great. That's not a great situation. On the other hand, if she goes out and she borrows the money, that's not great either, because she's only earning $2,000 a month, and now she has this debt overhang, this huge thing that she has to service every month. That's not a great situation either. So it's not obvious which one is better. But what you might say is she shouldn't have spent the money in the first place. She can't afford it, okay? And so it's not so much how do you finance the thing, it's whether you spend the money or not that is the major consideration. And so that little analogy is going to be appropriate when I show you some data from countries around the world, and that's actually going to be the story that you see in these data. So let me show you those data, okay? Let me tell you, so the punchline is going to be this. This is the punchline. It's spending, not deficits, that affect growth. And again, it's not obvious that it would go that way. You thought about good spending. I can think about good spending. Spend money on Stanford. That's great. Okay? Invest in human capital and education. That's what I sell. Buy my stuff. Great. Okay? But could go the other way. So it's not obvious which is good and which is bad. But as an empirical statement, spending is bad for growth. And the reason it's bad for growth is that if you spend more, you're eventually going to have to pay for it. You either pay for it now or you pay for it later, but you have to pay for it. And that means higher taxes. And high taxes are not good for investment and they're not good for work. And I'm going to show you that, okay? So those are the points that I want you to remember, but let me prove that to you. Prove is a little too strong. Let me try to convince you of that by showing you some data that back up that story, okay? So let's take a look. All right, so what I have here is a plot, a scatter plot, of data from the OECD countries with a couple of others added in, mostly OECD though. And if you look at those, what you see is on the horizontal axis, you have the deficit as a proportion of GDP. And on the vertical axis, you have the growth rate. And if I said, draw a line through those points, the best fitting line through those points, how many people know what a regression is? Anybody know that? Okay, raise your hands if you know what a regression is. Raise high. Okay. Well, it seems like you all know that, or almost all. What a regression is, of course, it's what guys like me do when they see a bunch of data points and they want to be able to sell it instead of just draw a line through. You can't just draw a line through. You got to say, hey, I'm a sophisticated statistician, so I ran a regression, okay? So if I ran a regression through this, what I'd get is a line that basically has a slope very close to zero. In other words, there's not much of a relationship between deficits and spending. And you can kind of see why. Look at these, you look at the points. Look at Ireland, for example. Anybody here from Ireland? No, anybody? No? Okay. Well, Ireland, as you probably know, has had a very strong growing economy for a couple of decades now. They kind of turned the whole place around, and it's done very well, but it also has a high deficit. You can see that, right? Ireland's running a high deficit. Greece, on the other hand, is also running a high deficit. Are they growing? No, we know Greece has been in trouble for a while. So their economy has been contracting. So you see high deficits, you see growth in Ireland, you see shrinking in Greece. Now go to the other side. Look at Korea. In Korea, what do you see? They're running a negative deficit. What's the name for a negative deficit? Surplus. Very good. So that means that you're bringing in more revenue to the government than you're actually spending. How are they doing? They're doing fine, okay? They're doing just fine. 3%, 3.5%, that's good. But it's not crazy good, okay? It's just fine. So the point is that there's no clear relationship between the deficit and the growth rate. But there is a strong negative relationship between the growth rate and spending. And if you look at that, you kind of say, but look at those countries that have big spending. Which countries are they? Well, you got some pretty good countries out there. Denmark, Finland, Scandinavian countries, France, Austria. Those are not poor, backward countries. Those are nice places. How many people have been to some of those places? Anybody? Anybody ever been? Good. You've been to Scandinavia? How many people been to Scandinavia? Good. How many people been to Austria? How many people have been to France? Okay, lots of you. They're pretty nice, the French have a lot of good stuff going on. Good food, good wine, all that stuff. But they spend a lot of money. So they have low growth, but they spend a lot of money. So when you spend money, a consequence of that is that it's going to drive down your growth rate. And that's not necessarily something that you'd say is bad. I mean, I may think it's bad, but the Danes are pretty sophisticated people, and they might simply say, look, we want to have very large social programs. That's a decision we make. And in order to finance those social programs, what we're going to do is we're going to spend a lot of money, and then what we're going to do is we're going to tax a lot. So look at Denmark. Why do they have high tax rates? It's obvious why they have high tax. Because they spend a lot. Okay? If you spend a lot, you got to pay for it. So what they decided to do is they decided that they're going to spend a lot and they're going to finance it with very high taxes. Now, yeah, I'll catch you in just a sec. Denmark, by the way, is a pretty open economy. So if you looked at Denmark, while they have high taxes, it's not a government-run economy. There's lots and lots of freedom. For example, the labor market, which I do know a little bit about, in Denmark is very open, very mobile. It's like the U.S. labor market. This is not the kind of labor market that you would think of, say, what you see in France or in Spain or in Portugal, where you do have major constraints. Denmark is open, but they have high taxes. Go ahead, please.
How do you calculate the average tax rate?
Okay, so the average tax rate here, this is, everybody know what OECD is? OECD is an organization that essentially, they do a lot of stuff, but one of the things they do best is they are really good at getting data across countries and making them comparable. Because, for guys like me, we want to have data that's comparable across countries. It's hard to do that on your own. You basically have to have a big team that goes out and gets data. So what they do here is they take in this case, it's OECD's definition. The reason I'm telling you about OECD is it's their definition of the tax rate. What they do is they take all taxes into account. So in Europe, that would be VAT, it would be income tax, it would be corporate taxes, everything into account, essentially take receipts at the government level, and you just divide that by GDP. So that's, in theory, that's what they're doing. Now obviously, people that are doing these things make mistakes, but they're pretty good. So they're pretty good. And this one happens to be averaged over 2010 to 2016, but you can pretty much take any period. You could do it over the full 2000s. It wouldn't look much different because those rates tend to be pretty stable over time. So that's what you have there. Okay? So what you see is that so far, deficits, no relation to growth, spending, negative relation to growth, tax rates, positive relation to spending. So what that tells you then is if you spend a lot, you're going to tax a lot. And do we care about that? Well, yeah, we do. Because what happens is if you tax a lot, you don't work very much. Okay, so now you'd say, why would that be? Can anybody think of why that might be? Anybody have any ideas of why that might be? Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah, so think about how hard you would want to work if your if your marginal tax rate were 89%. That's not a fictitious number. That number has existed historically, both in the United States. It existed in Sweden for a while. In fact, one of the big reforms that Sweden went through in the early 90s is they cut their taxes like crazy because they thought they were getting killed in terms of growth, primarily for that reason. Again, that's a policy decision. If you do that, you know that you're going to have to cut back on spending because you're going to have to finance that spending somehow. So essentially, that's what's going on. Yeah, go ahead, please. Hang on just for the mic, yeah. Go ahead.
How do you know that there's not reverse causality at play here?
Okay.
I could tell a story that Swedes are lazy, and so they have high taxes and social spending as a result of their laziness.
Yeah, okay. Now, so suppose you thought that Swedes, yeah, everybody heard it. Okay, suppose you thought that Swedes were lazy, and as a result, they had high tax rates. Well, that's possible, but that tends to be possible more in the time series than it is in the cross-section, and here's what I mean, okay? You can sustain that kind of a policy for a short period of time. It's harder to sustain that policy over time and see it consistently. So when you see it across countries, what you tend to see are long-run policies. So this kind of thing says that what you see is Sweden, if they were lazy, no one would be working. They couldn't finance those high expenditures. Eventually, they'd run out of money. So it could be a short-run policy, but not a long-run policy. That's why I said wouldn't matter much if I did this from 2000 to 2016. In fact, it wouldn't even matter that much if I did it back into the 70s, because these things tend to be pretty stable. There are some exceptions. Ireland would be an exception because they made a major transformation in the middle of this period. But for countries like Sweden, Scandinavian countries, they've been big spenders and and low work. The biggest ones, by the way, and I'll show you later, is if you look across the OECD countries, the biggest ones, the worst ones would be the ones that you would guess. It's France, Italy, and actually Germany that have very low hours of work relative to ours. By the way, when I say hours, this is more detail than you need, but when I say hours, what I'm talking about primarily is not just hours per work, but it is also labor force participation. So again, this is a little bit more wonky than you need for these purposes, but just so you can think this through. These numbers are essentially saying, let's take the total hours worked in the country and divide that through by the working age population. So it's hours worked per person, not hours worked per person in the workforce. So if you don't have many people in the workforce, then you're going to have low hours worked. And so it's a combination of two things. You can get low hours worked either because you don't work very long hours per week, or because not too many people are working. Either one of those things will do that. Okay? Now, it turns out we work long hours. Again, that's why I say I'm not so sure that's good. If you've been to France and all these other places, they have low growth rates, and they have low growth rates in large part because they're not investing as much and they're not working as hard. But life's not so bad in France. So again, I don't want to be too negative on those guys. The point is, it does have consequences.